Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Transcription services provided by transcribeme.com. Visit them on the web at transcribeme.com/beancast for up to 25% off. That's transcribeme.com. Episode 502, My Sexist AI. For Monday, July 2nd, 2018. It's time for this week's edition of the BeanCast, a weekly discussion about the news and issues facing marketers today. I'm your host, Bob Norp. Thanks for joining us. We worry about AI for many reasons, but is sexism on the list? What about whether it's enhancing more than just our tasks? In short, are there more practical issues to address other than appeasing our robot overlords? So tonight we'll discuss. Also, why exposure may be a better metric than viewability, whether agencies have anything to offer startups anymore, more GDPR woes, plus this week's @Fail 5. That's the lineup. Let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with the co-founder of Raven Public Relations, Mr. Matt Van Hoven. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, also joining us, we have the founder of the Deep Focus Agency Network and now president and CMO of music technology firm Music, Mr. Ian Schafer. Ian, I've waited so long to get you back on the program.
Hello, Bob. It is so nice to be back.
Glad that you have the time to do it now. Fantastic. Now, another person who we're pleased to have back is the newly installed president of Wonderman Chicago, Mr. Ian Sohn, another voice that we've waited a long time to get on the show, which is why I've booked two Ians today.
My mother is kvetching right now.
Kvelling, I think.
Yeah, kvelling, yeah.
Then finally, we welcome back the president of B2B content marketing agency specializing in the technology fields. Boy, I screwed this up, David. Mr. David Spark of Spark Media Solutions. David, what's going on?
You didn't screw it up, Bob. Don't knock yourself. It came out fine. You see, what happens is when you screw it up a little bit, then that becomes sort of an earworm to the people listening, and they remember, oh, now I remember this guy and his agency and what Bob and he talked about. So
that's a lot of explanation. There's a lot of exclamation. Oh boy, I can't even talk this time.
Exposition is what you're looking for. They're going to remember that as well.
Well, let's get into the topics where I actually do have prepared statements and can talk intelligently. Whenever we discuss the subject of AI on the show, artificial intelligence, it's always devolving into talk of robot overlords and loss of privacy and all the other things that make the modern world kind of a scary place to live in. But two articles in the tech press this week tackle some different concerns, namely that the fact that AI is being developed by technically minded men, and so while it's fairly good at solving problems, it's not very good at facilitating things like a greater humanity, and frankly, it's more than a bit sexist, despite the fact that many voices of AI and AI interfaces tend to be female. They also tend to be bossed around. They tend to be belittled by the users. So Ian Schafer, is AI reflecting some of the worst biases of humanity? And if so, what can we do to change that? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah. So let me start by kind of putting this in a bigger context. So Walt Mossberg, in his farewell piece at Recode, talked about the future of technology and the future of computing in general just being ambient, right? Kind of all around us. Not necessarily, all centralized in a screen. That's not necessarily, even though everyone thought convergence, was going to be all of our stuff on one screen. I think what we're learning is that it's just everything that's connected. And so if the future of technology is in fact ambient and it is all around us, it stands to reason that I guess having an interaction with technology should be at the very least as easy as having a conversation. I think now is an interesting point in time because there is a lot of conversation about civil discourse. When is it okay to be civil and when is it not? And I think there is also a point in time right now where technology is in a relatively clumsy state. And I think that AI in its current state, AI being a person, I think that's always the first place that people go, in launching new technology. So even Apple, when they launch new technologies or new icons or new operating system, they use that kind of, I know there's a word for it, I can't remember right now, but, like the notepad looks like a notepad, like it looks like the physical object it's meant to replace. And I think with AI, a lot of the voice assistants that you have right now, they're meant to sound like, again, like the thing that it's meant to replace, which is interacting with another human being to get something done. I think this is this weird, awkward step that we're taking with technology, and there may be several steps beyond it. And we've seen awkward steps with things like Google Glass and now even like Snapchat spectacles. Like these things are awkward and they're playing an odd role in society as we let it in. But I think ultimately, like we're going to be, in a place where AI is not attached to a personality. It's not attached to a human sounding voice as much as like computer was in Star Trek, right? Like it is going to be the kind of thing that, it's going to be transactional when it needs to be, when we ask it to do something or to make us dinner, and it's going to be, it's not going to respond to you when you need to get something done, like, turn on the lights in your home, or, maybe even like put your kids to bed. So, I mean, like this is just this awkward stage that we're in right now. And I think it stands to reason that a lot of the complaints that we have about AI are the same complaints that we have about
but
people.
there's a good argument to be made, though, Ian, that when you're developing a new technology, at the root, if it's something like inherently sexist, it's going to develop as a sexist personality. I mean, I agree with you wholeheartedly that it's clunky and awkward at this stage, and we can't expect all that much from it. But at the same time, to have these root fundamental flaws in the system is just going to proliferate. Boy, it's going to proliferate over time and become a real problem down the line.
I just think right now, like we're getting the AI that people make for us, whereas in the future we'll get the AI that we customize ourselves, right? And if it is personality based, it'll be the personality that we choose.
And hey, this is Ian Sohn. I think one of the things, Bob, that you're getting at is a conversation that we've probably all had with a creative director at some point recently in our careers, and that is, can a 22-year-old single male write ad copy for peanut butter or orange juice? Sure, but is it going to be as authentic and believable, and is the voice going to be as right as if someone in the target consumer market, if they wrote it? So I think that's what you're getting at, right? I mean,
well, the point that point makes sense to me, except that we're talking about, and I know all generalizations are false at their core, so forgive me for generalizing, but when you're talking about somebody whose job it is to create marketing messages, they're going to be a lot better at understanding humanity and understanding what's necessary to communicate to the target audience than a tech-minded programmer who, works in what is largely considered to be sexist environments in the technology fields. I mean, David,
we're evolving beyond that right now. We're trying to, at least, I mean, we can't hammer home this topic to death because this isn't the core of AI. And one of the arguments that this article makes is that they believe it's sexist because it is predicted by 2020 that more women's jobs will be replaced by artificial intelligence than male jobs. And this is one of the arguments for it being more sexist. And so I think there's a call out to stop that. But I would argue that we have an enormous history of technology taking, replacing jobs, but also creating brand new jobs. I mean, look at the array of new jobs we have these days because of technology that didn't exist before. And it literally never works to just complain and hope that the job comes back. It just doesn't at all. It just never works. So whether this is sexist or not, the call to stop this is not the way to stop it. But per what also Ian Schafer said at the very beginning, the definition of AI is extraordinarily broad, although in this story they kind of talk about it just being about robots and being these sort of characters that we know, like a Siri and Alexa or an actual image of a woman. But AI is truly in everything. I mean, there's artificial intelligence in your malware program. There's artificial intelligence telling you where to drive.
Oh yeah, no doubt,
today,
David, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, it's just like I believe that, and I know for a fact that AI is part of everything, and that the small subset of artificial intelligence that we interact with directly is just that. It's a small subset. It's the forward-facing human interface that gives us opportunities to interact with artificial intelligence in meaningful ways. It's just that it's also giving us the opportunity to express ourselves in ways that are not productive. And quite frankly, I think some of
define that. So define what express our ways and ways are not productive, because I don't.
Well, no, I mean, one example that was given, which was really resonated with me, and it was not in the article you're referencing, it was in another one, but it was talking about the fact that children are being trained to talk in rude ways to individuals just because they're interacting with these really clunky AIs and they're asking it to do stuff and it's not doing it correctly and they're yelling at it. And, it's facilitating, to a child's mind, it's facilitating this idea that somehow this is okay to talk to people like this, because Alexa,
haven't you ever done that when you've been on when you have one of those sort of automated response people on the phone and they're not understanding what you're saying and you get increasingly angry as you're
Yeah, but I'm
an
adult. I understand that I'm talking to a robot, and the reason I'm upset is because I'm talking to a robot. If a child's talking to an interface.
Well, don't you think they know that as well?
I don't think that they always do.
I don't know that they do. This is Ian Sohn. I had an incident recently where my 11-year-old was texting me, and I really took I took issue with the tone of his text. So I picked up the phone and I called him and I said, "What's going on with your text messages?" And he had no idea what I was talking about. And he said, "Oh, I was just voice dictating them." And so for him, it was just he was talking into his phone because he was voice dictating, and it was just coming out very kind of matter of fact and dry. And I was reading it with a certain tone that he didn't intend. So I don't know that they do know, to be quite honest.
That's a skill you develop over time, though, right? Like figuring out how to intonate via email and text and all that. And I do agree that it's a scary thought, but I think like so many other things that we've seen, there's a good model for what might happen here within digital itself. I can remember as a reporter when digital standards first started coming around, and they included things like, okay, we've been building websites for 10 years now, but, we just started to figure out that people who can't read are having a terrible experience on our websites, or the blind or the deaf, or, accessibility became an issue. And so standards were then developed to sort of give developers workarounds for, and solutions for people who have all sorts of different, physical attributes that they have to deal with in their daily lives. And so, isn't it reasonable? I would ask Schafer here, just because you've built so many, digital properties, that a standard would eventually come to exist that would help to guide these things, and maybe not explicitly jump right to, okay, how can we make kids better people, or better communicators rather? But don't you think that somebody will come out at some point and say, hey, let's create some guardrails here?
Yeah, I mean, if that's someone that exists outside the industry, like a regulatory body, for example. But I don't trust the industry to regulate itself. I mean, if you look at if you want to talk about the AI personalities that we talk to and deal with on a regular basis, all they're programmed to do is get us to buy more. So if that's the case, then it's got to come from someplace else other than companies whose root cause is commerce.
And that point that you just made, Ian, is key to the other argument about how AI is being developed in a haphazard way that it's not helpful to humanity. It's basically when you're using AI just to sell stuff, when you're using AI to just make it easier to sell things to people, what you're doing is you're saying we want a robot to replace a human in order to achieve something with higher efficiency. And, that core principle of AI, instead of looking at ways to enhance human interaction and to enhance the opportunities available for humans to do more, we tend to focus on the replacement idea. And, for me, it's not so much that that's like robot overlords coming. It's just that it's not helpful, nor is it productive to human society to have replacements as much as it is to have opportunistic.
Here's the big argument.
Go ahead, David Spark.
So here's the big argument against what you just said. And I will tell you, in the security field, this is a huge, huge selling point. Artificial intelligence will reduce the staff members you need to secure your environment. And so many security vendors are selling that service. You install our technology, you need less people to maintain security in your environment. You don't need as many sort of worker bee level type people to do this, that you can have sort of higher level people read the information and consume it. That is an enormous selling point in that industry.
Yeah, it's an enormous selling point. But
the automation of the vehicle assembly line made cars cheaper for all of us, right?
Yeah, I mean, automation is not a bad thing. Don't get me wrong when I'm saying here. I'm not saying that it's bad to automate repetitive tasks and to free up humans for more, opportunity. But we're creating technology to just replace humans without giving humanity more opportunity to shine and do better things. And I think that's the missing element in most AI development. We're always trying to solve the problem, how do we get rid of these inefficient humans, as opposed to how can we free these inefficient humans to be more productive in their own way and contribute more to the company. It's always being sold, like David said, as a way to reduce worker bees and to take them out of the equation, as opposed to saying, what can we do with all these worker bees now in order to become more productive and more efficient?
But in the security field, I should just point out, the security field is so deficient in staff. Over 3-4 years ago, Cisco came out with a report that said we need 1 million more security professionals. So it's not a case of, you're replacing them. And it's like, all those headcounts that you need to hire, you don't need to hire all of them, because of now you'll have this new product. Again, this is, a pie in the sky selling point, but that's kind of the theory.
But could we be just too early in the arc of the AI narrative to really have clarity on what it's going to do? I think we're wise to be cautious, but I take a good example from how we got to the moon in the first place, which is just a story that I love. But I mean, really, the rockets that propelled us into space were developed as part of the military-industrial complex, for war. And so it wasn't until NASA got their hands on them that they were able to put them to a better use. And then all the technology and advancements that have come from space travel and everything it takes us to get there have been, dramatically helpful to the human race. And so, from my perspective, I think we might be just too early to say, well, it's going in the wrong direction, because initially a lot of things go in the wrong direction until somebody with maybe a better heart or a better mind for what the potential uses are and can actually make use of the technology, can do something truly productive with it. But until we get to that point, we probably need some guardrails.
Or sometimes we just elect a certain individual to be the president of the United States. I mean, it's just like, I don't want to be a Luddite here, but I do believe that we need to, we need to address these questions now. It's not so much that I believe that technology is bad and that technology is leading us down this path where we're going to be somehow replaced by computers and everything's going to go south for us, and suddenly I'm going to be in a ditch next to some guy named John Connor. I mean, I really believe that this is a great opportunity for us, but I also see that there are problems and you need to address them at the root, or else they fester and become big problems. And we've seen the results of that very, 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 very obviously in our society recently.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a hint of concern to me, it's something that was, that you brought up, Bob, as you were presenting this topic, which is that, there's a lot of guys that fit into a certain sort of mold that are creating this technology, and until you get some diversity of background in in the people that are developing these things, you're going to see a lack of products coming out that are actually addressing like larger and different issues. And so right now we're set to solving hairy problems that are being researched and executed through companies like Cisco that are trying to solve real issues. But in doing so, they kind of leave a lot of others behind. And so, until we get more people, developing in this space and working that represent a broader swath of who we are as individuals. Yeah. I mean, as an example, I recently switched Siri and all my different AI helpers over to male voices just to see what the experience was. And I can't tell you if I'm yelling less at things. I think I'm still just as mad as I ever was when things don't work and frustrated as a user. And so, how do we behave when we're communicating with these technologies? Is that on us to just become more civil, patient people with our technology? I mean, there's a huge question about how, people interact with these technologies that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface on that, like as the example before with kids, could have bigger implications than we're really seeing right now.
And I think you hit the nail on the head about the fact that we need more diversity in the development process. And I don't think that it's just diversity of having women in the development teams. I think that would be a great start. But I think that we also need to bring in the human element into the development process and hire philosophers, hire people who are artists, get the individuals in there who have the heart and have the understanding and can guide the development process of this in a much more intelligent way. David, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just saying is that there was an interesting study that was done not too long ago that found that when we get onto chatbots, the first thing we do with chatbots is we actually flirt with them. So the irony is, we yell at other technologies, but chatbots, we want to have a date with them. So it's bizarre. It all depends on how we're approaching it and whether it's delivering a service that we're specifically asking for, or we're trying to sort of explore something together with the artificial intelligence. In that case, we want to go out with it.
I wonder what a good date with a chatbot would be like.
Just go to Tinder or OkCupid and you can date as many chatbots as you'd like. Well, moving on. I read an interesting opinion piece this week on moving beyond viewability as a metric in favor of exposure as a metric. Now, Ian, and I'm talking to Ian Sohn now, I'm not sure I entirely understand the author's argument here, but is it even possible to effectively measure the length and breadth of an ad exposure independent of viewability? You're the best hope I have at answering this question, so what's your thoughts?
That's a scary thought. I read the piece a couple times and really had to think about it quite a lot. I mean, I think the first problem is, and it's always surprising to me that it's 2018 and I can't print every time without fail. And also that there's still no kind of common lexicon or definition within our industry on a host of topics, including this one. And we're clearly an industry that's struggling to create smart, data-driven attribution across all kind of online touch points. And so the effect has been that people have different kind of factions within the industry have started creating their own standards. So in this case, we're talking about viewability, right? And for the sake
of the listeners out there, I mean, I always go over this topic, and we've talked about it many times, but viewability is defined generally by the IAB as being 50% viewable for 1 second on screen.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And
which,
so,
by the way, that is horrible.
Right.
Like, why doesn't anyone just shout out? Because that is an awful, awful definition. No one likes that.
So what strikes me about it, and this is not, I'm sure I'm the 8 millionth person to make this argument, but what if 49.9% of the pixels of an ad are in view for 5 minutes or 10 minutes? Does that somehow make that unit not viewable anymore? Because I would be happy to take something that's 0.1% less viewable, but is viewed for 4 minutes and 59 seconds longer.
But Ian, hold on. what if your ad copy is at the top of the image and the 50% is the bottom of the image? Like, wouldn't that, or it's like your 70% at the bottom of the image has no ad copy and the top 30% has it? Like, wouldn't that aggravate you? Like, this is useless to me.
Yeah, of course. So yes, I think it is completely obviously flawed. I think ultimately, obviously, there are a lot smarter people who are trying to figure this out, but we need a kind of a more concrete definition of what success is. It's probably a cocktail of measurements that ultimately define the success of any kind of ad unit. And I think we need to know, not only is the unit a quote success in a vacuum, but also as part of a multi-channel targeting strategy, and that ultimately drives the consumer to take the desired action that the marketer wants, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's just like there's a million ways to slice and dice the whole viewability question. I mean, David brings up a great point, and I'm sure some of the best designers out there have already thought about the fact that we need to keep the ad copy above the line. You know, it's just like above that 50%
above
line.
and below. You never know where it's going to be, too. Like, here's the thing. What if the print... I don't know why anyone accepted this as a definition, because what if the print industry just decided, oh, we're going to only literally print half of your ad in our magazine? Like, I mean, that's all we're going to do. I'm sorry, by our standards, 50% of your printed ad is considered viewable. And we'll maybe print the first half of the bottom half. Like, no one would. So I don't understand why this was accepted in the industry. Anyone who buys an ad wouldn't be happy with this, but we bizarrely accepted it.
I think that to me the bigger kind of more philosophical question to ask is, do we really want to spend our time trying to, as marketers and advertisers, on kind of gaming the format, or do we want to spend the time trying to get the message right, getting the media mix right, trying to tap into some kind of emotion or movement or whatever it may be? I mean, this just feels... I know this is naive, but I come from the creative side of the business. This feels to me like it's a shell game, when really we should be focusing on things that are kind of much more fundamental, which is, what are we trying to say and how are we resonating with people who we want to buy our product or service?
Well, that brings me back to the original question, exposure. Does exposure solve that? I mean, it's just like, for me, I'm listening to this guy or reading this guy's article, and I have no idea what he's actually proposing in terms of how we would measure exposure, because the suggestion that we measure the entire impact of, whether or not the most important part of the message is above the line, whether or not the person is interacting with that advertisement, whether or not they're hearing it but not seeing it. I mean, how do you measure those things? How do you get to the point where you're understanding the total exposure of an individual to an advertisement? It seems like it's an impossible pipe dream.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a fool's errand. I mean, mostly because there's too much. I have a theory that there's way too much money in advertising. There are digital properties that shouldn't exist because of the amount of advertising that they have on their site, which gives rise to all the things that we get, like troll farms and clickbait factories and things like that, because it's designed, someone said it before, like to game the system. I mean, there is just too many dollars out there for people to like pull little bits and pieces from. And that's why we're having these conversations about, viewability and exposure, because the reality is that if there were fewer ads and there were more, and if they were all, if not mostly, premium, we'd have a lot more recall, aided and unaided awareness. Like, all these problems that we currently face would probably be solved. But instead, we've got to, we have an industry that's so big that has to preserve all the problems that it's the solution for.
Yeah, I want to just add to that. I think, to me, it's an example of, the sort of big media race to the bottom problem that's persisted in the industry for so long. And, how can we get a cheaper cost per acquisition? Well, try to acquire more people and, run better copy and better creative. But, to Ian's point, like, isn't there some stat that like something like 80% of people have banner blindness? And so at the end of the day, whatever,
I'm in that category.
Right. We don't even see them. And so to kind of navel gaze and try and redefine, well, what is exposure, what is viewability, to me seems a little bit moot when you've got brands out there, just trying to create more interesting, relevant content. An example that I love is a partnership between GE and Vice, where they created something called Drone Week that was like a 4-minute spot, but it actually ran during, a Vice programming. And so, when you've got brands kind of heading in that direction, viewability questions seem to be less relevant because there are so many better ways to reach your audience in an interesting, content-driven way that's going to help your business versus, trying to sort of race against everyone else to get on more sites.
Let me play devil's advocate for a minute, because we're all getting on the media side, or we're all going against the media companies and saying, well, this is stupid and this doesn't make sense and viewability doesn't work. But at the same time, look at how advertising has always worked. You pay for an advertisement whether or not the person is in the room or going to get a beer out of their fridge. You pay for the ad that gets printed in the magazine whether or not the person's just flipping by. Yet at the same time, wait. I got a whole point to be made. The point here is that every single ad impression, even minimal ad impressions, add up over time into an aggregate effect. So a great case in point, I would have never had any idea that TD Ameritrade was running these advertisements if they didn't run them constantly in repetition over and over again while I'm watching my Reuters news every morning, to the point where when I was in a bar the other night, it's just like I met the guy who was coming in, who was the guy from that commercial. And it's just like, I would have never recognized him nor been able to point out, oh, you're the guy from the TD Ameritrade ad, unless I had seen those repetitions of these ads, which are quite frankly pretty boring and not really all that effective in and of themselves, but over time they had an effect on me. So doesn't that make a case for viewability being in that 50% for 1 second as being some kind of contributing factor into the frequency effect of advertising? I get no one to go against me, huh?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's all but I think we're talking about two different things. I think in the aggregate, of course, there is an impact unquestionably, again, in the aggregate. But the debate that we started off having was, how do you value, how do you put a monetary value on that kind of single unit, and what's the best way to value it? I have no idea, but I do agree, well, because I it's the industry I've chosen to go in, that yes, in the aggregate, those messages will have a cumulative effect on kind of the heart and mind of consumers.
Okay, so I work in the PR side of the business, and I believe deeply in the power of a good story to change people's minds, and so I inherently am sort of, despite working with agencies all the time, dubious towards the impact of content that you just have to show frequently in order to get people to think about it. Bob, for you, I'd ask, well, are you going to go switch to TD Ameritrade now because you simply saw those ads, or is there any value to the fact that you've seen it? And I can't really answer that question. But at the end of the day, we're trying to convince people to do something, and for my money, it's much more impactful to put a validated voice behind it and to make sure that the right people see it. And so in my business, viewability is the number one issue, right? If no one sees the story, what good is it? And so what we do now is we use advertising
you need more than viewability, though, and I think that's the crux of the argument. Viewability is purely a branding metric. It's something that says you've got an impression, you made some kind of impact, you've made people aware that you exist. Whereas what you're talking about, when you're telling a story, you need much more than viewability. You need understanding. You need cognizant understanding of what you're trying to communicate, or else you're not effective. And effectiveness is ultimately the metric that you live by.
I think the point that person who's writing the story is trying to make is that viewability is like an ad tech term, right? And so the viewability, it's like literally like we were talking about before, the percentage of pixels that show up on a page that makes it possible for someone to see it, right? It's not like, whereas an exposure is saying, yes, this person was exposed to this ad, which, by the way, doesn't mean they actually saw it or pay attention to it either. I just think that they're different, like, strains of a crappy argument that says, these are the things that mean that you're getting an ROI on your investment, on your ad spend. Whereas the reality is, 9 out of 10 of them suck, right? And nobody clicks on ads. So it's about like what is the effectiveness, and it's got to go way beyond, way further down the funnel than certainly like viewability and exposure. It's just to make media buyers feel better about what they bought, and maybe their clients too.
And make media companies a little bit richer, because they get the opportunity to make sure that they get paid for the impression, which is ultimately why this is what it is. It's basically a negotiated truce between the media buyers and the media sellers. Well, we got to move on. As if agencies didn't have enough challenges these days, startups are now even questioning whether working with ad shops is worth their time and money. But unlike bigger businesses that are simply looking for efficiencies and cost, startups are more concerned with things like timing and attention, and how much creative force is going to be brought to bear for their problems and at what speed. Which brings me to this question, Matt. Can agencies ever be as nimble as a startup needs them to be? What's your take on this one?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, for a lot of people that aren't watching, it seems impossible, right? Because the incentive structures are totally different. So if I'm a startup, either I've got funding and I've got time to build what I want to build, maybe a year or something, or I'm just, I have no funding and I'm driven by passion and I want to produce something, and I really have no parentage, keeping me from that goal. So, and then the agency side, you've got a standard structure that requires revenue every month in order to pay people off. So they're incentivized differently. But, I think with digital, what we saw was a big transition from, sort of the waterfall structure, the traditional agency model where, the brief is given to strategy develops the insight gets passed to creative, from creative to media production, and so on and so forth. And that model doesn't really work very well for startups because, hey, we need to test something quickly and get it built and put it out in the world and see what happens. And so, if there's a failure at the production level, it seems really hard to bring it back to strategy to get it fixed. And so everyone comes to the table at the same time. They iterate and utilize sprints to get things done quickly. And everything just seems like it's totally incongruous from the agency model. But there have been, and I think digital has played a large part in this, a number of agencies that have transitioned to where, at least in their development part of their process, they're using more of an agile structure, 2 to 3 week sprints, get the shopping cart built rather than building the entire e-commerce website. And so there's agencies out there that do this. Big Spaceship has been using Agile for a long time. There's an interesting shop out in Santa Rosa, California called The Engine is Red that, a couple of years ago closed on a Friday. They had been running as a waterfall agency for 6 years and reopened on Monday, all in on Agile. And so they use the structure for everything from development work to, building a strategy to rebranding or creative or whatever. And so there are ways to do this, right? We just don't hear it talked about because I think the bigger, holding company-owned agencies, if they're doing this, they're tending not to put it forward, or it's just not built enough momentum. But there are ways to do it. Furthermore, there's companies out there now like Venture Fuel, run by a gentleman named Fred Schonenberg. He basically runs a global list of startups that he works with and vets, and then brings them to agencies and brands that are either not able to develop something in-house or don't want to invest the resources, so they bring in an outside partner to do it. So this is happening. It's just not happening in ways I think that are quite as obvious as some of the other big changes happening in the industry. And with time, I think we're going to continue to see more of it. But the frustration startups are feeling is pretty straightforward, right? It's like, we're used to operating in a certain way. You're bringing us in and putting a bunch of boundaries that are marketing related around us, or maybe political, and we don't quite understand how to navigate this territory. So for the agencies that are really doing this best, they get how to do the quick, the rapid iteration, quick prototyping, all that kind of stuff, but they also get the marketing side. And I would guess that Deep Focus at certain points in its history made this transition. Schafer, I don't know if you can speak to it any better than I can, but.
Yeah, I can speak to it, and I can tell you the lesson that I learned, which is that if you were to ever tell me that I would have the chance to work with a client, but that client didn't make any money, would you still want to work for that client? And no. I would say now my answer is no.
Right.
So, right. And most startups don't make money. They spend a lot of it, right? But they spend a lot of it in different ways. They spend it in different ways than a business that actually makes profit does. So they put, 100% of that, the cost of what we would typically call as advertising and marketing into customer acquisition, right? Because they know what a lifetime, customer value is. And when I say startups, I mean mostly like direct to consumer startups. Yes, there are maybe some enterprise startups that are probably in their fourth or fifth year that might be making money and realize that they have to build brand. But even startups that lose money in acquiring customers because that's how much money they have left in their round to do that. Like eventually, and we're seeing this right now, they're realizing, well, crap, I just saturated my Facebook spend, and that looks like I have to consider transit or I have to consider TV. And guess what? Like the people that know how to do that are agencies. But I would say, like, if I was an agency, I would question whether or not, I would want to work for a startup, and would they make a better client than, say, the 7 rounds of procurement that I have to go through to, work with this CPG company that is tremendously profitable. Now, there's probably like pros and cons of both of those sides. But for an agency, someone recently told me that every agency is about 3 months away from going out of business right now, no matter how big or small they are. I wouldn't want to put my chips on a startup to save me.
When I listen to you describe startups, and from my own experience in working with startups and working in startups, there's a certain maturity factor as well that needs to be addressed. And I'm wondering whether or not it's always a good thing to be nimble, as opposed to maybe bringing discipline and order and real brand chops into the process early on. Could a startup benefit from just taking a breather, or do the demands of the startup community and the demands of the venture capital backers actually drive them to make choices that aren't best for the brand in the long term?
So
Yeah.
there's a lot of issues. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
There are a lot of, so let's take a step back and just understand the structure of a startup and the speed that they have to operate, and the structure of an established company. An established company already has a brand that they need to protect and need to also, grow and keep going. A startup often does not have a brand. It's unknown. And so therefore, in some cases, they can take risks because they're not beholden to stockholders, they're beholden to investors, yes, but they can take risks. So there's structurally, they're very, very different, creatures for that matter. And then the other issue is that, I've worked in ad agency. Ad agencies, I'm sorry, work unbelievably slow. I mean, I've worked at agencies that work at a snail's pace, and I'm amazed at how long it takes us to get out a single email marketing campaign. I mean, it's mind-blowing how slow it takes sometimes.
But that's radically.
I don't want to speak to some of your agencies, but the other issue is at startups, everyone wears multiple hats all the time, and speed to market is critical. And often they will forego many things that other organizations can't forego because they have to be protective about brand, because they have to be protective about so many different issues. So they can forego certain things, like not having multiple layers of sort of account management that an agency can deliver an offer, to be able to work quickly and test and experiment out there.
So, hey, Bob, it's Ian Sohn. I for years I worked on the same floor. I don't know if you are all familiar with the space called 1871 in Chicago, but it's a space where there are a lot of tech startups that are working in the Chicago area, and so I've had a chance to both formally and informally mentor a lot of these folks. And what I've found is that you have to always remember when you're talking to these, especially the founders, a lot of times you're talking to technical founders. And so you go in and you want to advise them about branding or marketing or advertising. What you quickly realize is that they are extremely sophisticated in what they do, but can be very unsophisticated in the world of marketing and advertising and branding. And so they work at a faster pace, yes, perhaps than we do at agencies, but they also sometimes don't necessarily appreciate the craft of of what we do, which is understandable because it's not the world that they come from.
Well, they may not
but they
understand
don't
that.
need it at that stage
No,
of their business.
okay,
That's
David.
right.
David,
I agree with that.
no,
I
no,
agree
I
with that also.
disagree. I disagree wholeheartedly. I think that every brand should understand at its core who we are and what our mission is, and that doesn't mean that you need to have a defined logo or you need to have a defined name for every product and have a brand hierarchy, but you should know who you are as a company. And ultimately, that's the brand. And I think that there is not enough communication or not enough understanding and valuing of this core identity, establishing a core identity from the start with these small companies. And the best companies are ones that establish some kind of identity early on. And they stick to it and they make a difference upon it. It doesn't mean like
I think some of them get it though, Bob. Like, if you're one of 5 scooter startups in San Francisco, something's got to set you apart.
Well, exactly. That's what I'm saying. The ones that do get it do understand the discipline and do understand the need for having an established identity, usually the ones that rise to the top. And I don't think that we're having enough discussion about the fact that a lot of these startups may be moving too fast for their own good. And I think that's ultimately what I'm trying to get to. Is this like, is there a way to slow them down?
That's normally not their decision. That's their boards or their investors' decision, right? They are under crushing pressure.
Agreed.
Well, and let me throw something out there too that I think that helps just elaborate why this is such a problem. I work with agencies all the time. We speak with them on the phone a lot of times about positioning and what they want to do with the business. And, agencies very often come to the table and they all kind of say different versions of the same thing. What's different about us is we're collaborative, we're creative, our strategy department is insane, like X, Y, and Z, you name it. And it's all things that you could say about any company in the space. And these are people who are doing some of the best work in the world, in some cases, and sometimes they just can't see the forest for the trees on their own business. Or if they do see the forest for the trees, they're, using what works in the room and not what works, with the general public or with people that are going to be learning about them, right? And so if agencies can't do it, if they can't figure out their brand, and they many times they do, but it takes a while, and it's iterative and it's ongoing. It's not just one and done. And if I'm a startup and I'm moving quickly, I want to get the marketing and the branding out of the way now and move on to the next thing. And maybe there's not enough thought going into that process because people aren't guiding them that way. Because people that mentor startups tend to be former startup owners, and we're like, okay, there's a time and a place for this. And so, if we're not hand-holding with startups, they're not going to get it, just like anything else that they're going to try and do.
Well, we're running out of time, so I got to move on to the next topic real quick. Just when you thought your GDPR woes were behind you, comes word that more than a few experts out there are saying that practically every major advertiser is most likely out of compliance in one way or another. David, considering how vague the requirements of GDPR are, is there anything short of court rulings for setting up legal precedents to solve this problem? What's your take on the current state of GDPR as of week number 4?
So everyone in the security industry is watching GDPR and also in advertising as well. And they're watching to see who's suing who, because actually consumers can put out lawsuits as well, if they so want. But I should also mention just about all kind of regulations in general, and I know within the security community, it's almost impossible to be 100% compliant at all times. So this is like always an ongoing issue with regulations. It just is. GDPR, though, is a different animal in that it is vague in the beginning. And one of the major complaints about it is it's this kind of all or nothing thing. You either give us explicit permission to track you, and that means tracking your personal identifiable information. If not, you have to be completely anonymized within the system. And you also have to realize that Europe in general has always had higher privacy rules than we do in the US. So there's that issue that it's just, that's all they put out there, and everyone's sort of approaching that in a different way. What's going to happen is when the first lawsuits start coming down, and they happen, like per what you asked, that's when the whole sort of industry is going to start shifting, and they're going to wait. And should mention that I talked about this on my podcast. I have a podcast about security, and there's an Austrian privacy advocate, Max Schrems, who's really been working the system for a while, and he filed lawsuits with both Facebook and Google for a total of 8.8 billion on day one. And it was all about this sort of single checkbox to access services. I mean, those companies are really, really large, and it's either you say, yes, we track everything, or no, and you essentially barely get to use our service.
Yeah, we covered that on the show a couple of weeks ago, forced
that's been
consent.
the major complaint.
Yeah.
The big deal is privacy policies are always confusing, but I will make a call out to one company that we talked about on my podcast, a company called Juro, spelled Juro. And they published a privacy policy that was really, really simple to read. And any non-lawyer could read it, understand it, and it would make sense to them.
You know, I can understand the value of having simple statements and simple processes for users to make sure that they're understanding what they're getting themselves into when they work with sites. But I kind of feel like the whole situation has become so completely untenable. It starts off, everybody's worried about it. Then everybody figures it out. We're just going to purge our email list. Then they figure out they don't need to do that they just need to go ahead and say, do an update to their terms of service, to their privacy.
Well, everyone was worried about it, though, because of the potential fines.
But,
I mean, the fines are up to 20 million euros or 4% of global revenues.
Right. And my point is that the European Union, shouldn't they have at least have set up the opportunity for a question and answer situation? You know, it's just like where you can actively talk to people on how to be compliant with this.
It's possible that exists. I don't actually even know if that, but
it seems like if you're gonna enforce a law that takes away that much profitability from a company, it seems to me that you need to put in place an opportunity for any company to question you and say, is this compliant? And for you to say, yes, this is, or no, this isn't, before I get sued into the ground. It seems like it doesn't make any sense to have a law that that's not understandable to the companies it governs, and leaving them open to all kinds of legal challenges down the line without some kind of arbiter up front to say, this is in compliance, this is not in compliance.
Well, again, we'll see that. But their big statement of explicit consent is kind of the critical statement. So there are companies that are having opt-in versus opt-out ways of addressing explicit consent. So it's not 100% sure. Everyone's having their own interpretation. It will come down the line where someone says, we don't like that interpretation, I guess, or there'll be updates to GDPR. I'm sure it will happen. But I think the very first lawsuits, when they start coming down and people are actually paying out, that's when the market will shift. And unfortunately, someone's going to be a scapegoat in this process.
Well, with that, it's time for the Ad Fail 5. But before we get to that segment of the show, I do want to take this quick opportunity to thank my guests again and allow them to each do a shameless plug. Starting with Matt Van Hoven. You can find him at ravenpublicrelations.com. That's the home of Raven Public Relations, the company he co-founded. Tell us what's going on in your world, Matt. What would you like to promote?
Well, I don't have a whole lot to promote. I just would say that if you're not doing PR as an agency, you're not doing agency work. So come give us a call and we'll help you figure it out.
Fantastic. Now, next up, Ian Schafer. You can find him at Music Connect. That's with a Z and a K. Believe me, I will put the link on the site so that you can get to him. But tell us, Ian, what would you like to promote?
I'd like to promote that everyone looking for a great PR firm should work with Matt Van Hoven.
Thanks, Ian.
Well done.
Selfless.
Also with us, Ian Sohn. You can find him at Wonderman.com. Is there a unique Wonderman URL for Chicago's office, or is it just going through the main site?
Go through the main site. I've been there a total of 3 weeks, so I have nothing to promote, but just I would ask you to take my call, if not you, well, you in particular, but you, the royal you. If I call you sometime in the next few months, and I'd also like to advocate for more parents to name their children Ian, because I think it's just wonderful.
And last but not least, David Spark. You can find him at sparkmediasolutions.com. That's the home of his content marketing agency, which is fantastic. Tell us what's going on in your world, David. What would you like to promote?
Well, first, I want to just compliment the whole panel. I'm not blowing smoke up anybody's butts here, but I have been on many, many BeanCasts, and I am so sort of impressed with the quality of discussion and really intelligence and wisdom of the rest of the panelists. And I am so appreciative to be among this group. So thank you, Bob, and thank the others on this panel.
I'm thinking nobody was drinking. I think that's the probably.
That may have had something to do with it.
And that's with 100 push notifications about LeBron signing with the Lakers.
That's right. That's right.
But I do have something to promote, and that is my new podcast, which I'm literally going to be recording the next episode minutes after I finish this one. And it's for anybody who works in security and tries to actually sell security products too. It's called the CISO. CISO stands for Chief Information Security Officer. CISO Security Vendor Relationship Podcast. My co-host is actually the CISO for Lyft, Mike Johnson, and he's awesome. If you don't follow him on LinkedIn, you should be, because he has really become a voice within the whole security community of how to engage. And really, there's a lopsided relationship between security vendors, there's 3,000 plus of them, and security buyers, which are often the CISOs, and they're kind of all hammering them and they're overwhelmed. So this is a podcast about improving that relationship. And it's really kind of, I'm so appreciative the audience are really enjoying it. So if you're in that audience or you have clients in that space, please listen to the podcast.
Sounds really, really interesting. So thank you. Thank you for telling us about that. As for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me. And of course, you can find out how to advertise on this program. So check it all out at thebeancast.com. And don't forget, transcribeme.com/beancast is your source for any transcription needs. They are our official transcription partner. So if you need a transcription of this episode or any episode over the last few weeks, just go to our site at thebeancast.com and look it up. And now it's time for the Ad Fail 5, a rundown of the lowest moments in advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last week. And first up, Ticketmaster UK is in a bit of a hot water after it was revealed that the ticketing giant had a data breach that it failed to report, Ian, to its customers for 2 months. You'd figure, Mr. Sohn, it's just like you'd figure that these companies would figure out eventually that when you have a data breach, it's imperative to let people know immediately, especially when you're in the European Union. I know that the UK is Brexiting, but they're still in the European Union.
Didn't Tylenol solve this for us back in the early 80s with the cyanide catastrophe? You just fess up to it right away and you fix it. This is tried and true. Matt, you can speak to this from a PR standpoint. This is like 101 as far as I'm concerned.
Super basic. And also I'm really worried because I don't want people to know how many Taylor Swift tickets I bought over the course of my life. So hopefully it remains just a UK thing.
This is just another case of getting screwed by Ticketmaster, just another way.
Now, WPP is still wallowing in the aftermath of Sir Martin's exit, including launching an internal investigation to find information leakers, as well as trying to figure out who is behind an unidentified WhatsApp account that is contacting current and former employees with close associations to Sorrel. Matt, I'm looking at this and I'm going, this is like getting to be very Games of Thrones-ish if it wasn't already kind of Games of Thrones-ish.
It's getting more and more interesting by the day. I got to say, I actually ran into Sir Martin in Cannes this year, and it was my first time there. And I just got to say, the guy's got a great tan, so I'm thinking he's not worried about a thing.
I don't think Sir Martin is the problem. I think WPP is having the issues right now. So anyway, a Norwegian study suggests something that most of us already guessed implicitly. Facebook and Google manipulate and use scare tactics, Ian, to convince users to this. It gets really difficult to tell which one of you to go forward. So, Mr. Schafer, I'm just going to say, Mr. Schafer, I'm going to you with this one.
There is an entire school of thought that I discovered today there's a piece on TechCrunch today about dark UX, which is basically like getting people to click on things that they would never click on otherwise, or opt into things that they would never opt in otherwise, by using, just psychological tricks and warfare, basically. So none of this surprises me. I mean, this is, if we've said it, like, if you are the product, right? Like, you are the product of these companies. So what you always do, if you're a company that sells product, you find ways to make more money off your product. So this is not surprising to me at all.
No, it's not surprising at all. It's kind of like a study that's like, gee, at least you quantified the fact that they've been using scare tactics to get me to give up my privacy. Now I'm feeling so much better about myself.
Yeah, Gmail is so good. So at the end of the day, does it really matter?
And that's the point. Well, next up, Facebook has let us know they have disabled 1.3 billion fake accounts, David. For those counting at home, that's half of their user base. It's just like they've always said that 50% of advertising was, wasted. This kind of exemplifies that in living color. We've got 50% of the audience potentially being fake at any given time.
Well, I don't know if this comes as a surprise to you, social media or not, but I got fake friends in real life. So the fact that they're in social media, it's no different. I mean, it's not a shock to me.
And my favorite one of the week, ratemyprofessor.com thought it was a good marketing ploy to boost engagement by adding a chili pepper rating to teacher profiles so students could rank an individual's hotness. I'm thinking, my God, Ian Sohn, I'm listening to this and I'm going, in the Me Too movement and with the Time's Up movement and everything else going on, why would you think it would be a good idea to rank teachers by their hotness? I mean, in what world did someone think this was okay?
I'm not even going to come close to touching this one, Bob.
Wait a second. Isn't this how Facebook started? This is
Yes.
exactly how Facebook. So why not model another successful company?
This exists in a world where we look to Pornhub for great advertising.
Well, have something to add to this list or just want to discuss it, comment online, use the hashtag AdFail5. That's pound AdFail and the number 5. And that does it for this week's show. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com and click on the subscribe link. If you're an iTunes listener, we've also provided a direct link to the iTunes Music Store, or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory of iTunes. And whichever podcast directory you use, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C. Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. We'll be back again next week. Hope you'll join us then.
Like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. It's just like, okay, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know, like if it's, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly. It's like exactly. Yeah. You know what I mean? Exactly.
Cool beans.